frozen highway, a dying diner, and 5 men who buried their brother 25 years ago. Tonight, on a Veterans Day that smells like diesel and regret, an 8-year-old girl walks through the door holding a dead man's necklace, a necklace that was never supposed to exist again. The serial number engraved on the back belongs to a soldier the United States government declared killed in action in a country that officially never had American boots on the ground. 5 aging bikers recognize that engraving because they carved it themselves. In a bunker, under fire, the night their 6th brother vanished forever, or so they believed. If this story keeps you up tonight, hit that like button, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from, and stay until the very last word, because this one doesn't let go. The rain came sideways across Route 89 like God had tilted the desert on its edge and let the sky drain. Wade Dalton killed the engine of his Road King and sat motionless in the saddle, watching water stream down his cracked leather gloves. The parking lot of Maggie's roadside was mostly empty. 3 pickups, 1 sedan with a cracked windshield, and a county maintenance truck that hadn't moved since September. The neon sign above the door blinked half its letters. What should have read open 24 hours instead read OPN 4HORS in broken pink light that bled across the wet asphalt like a wound. Behind him, 4 motorcycles cut their engines one by one. Nobody spoke. They never did after memorial rides. The 200 miles from the Veterans Cemetery outside Prescott to this stretch of forgotten highway between Flagstaff and nowhere had drained whatever was left in their chests. Forge, that's what they called him, because Wade Dalton hadn't used his birth name in 20 years, swung his right leg over the seat and felt the familiar grinding in his knee. Titanium rod, courtesy of a roadside device in Helmand Province that took his kneecap and the lower half of his left ear in the same half-second. He didn't limp anymore. He'd trained himself not to, but on cold nights like this, his body remembered what his discipline tried to forget. Forge. The voice belonged to Ray Clutch Medina, his vice president. Clutch was 6'3", 240, and the gentlest man in any room until someone threatened a child. Then he became something that didn't have a name in polite language. He stood beside his heritage softail, with his collar turned up against the rain, his silver beard dripping. "We going in or we standing here growing moss?" Forge looked at the diner. Something in his stomach turned. Not hunger. Not the bad coffee he'd had at the gas station 40 miles back. Something older. Instinct. The kind of feeling that used to keep him alive in places where the sand was red and the nights lasted forever. "Yeah," he said. "We're going in." The 5 of them walked across the parking lot in formation without thinking about it. 2 decades out of uniform, and they still moved like a fire team. Forge at point, Clutch on his left shoulder. Behind them, Danny Wrench Kowalski, the club's mechanic, whose hands could rebuild a carburetor blindfolded but shook uncontrollably every night at 0300 when the dreams came. Beside Wrench walked Tomas Fuse Reyes, the club's demolitions expert in another life, who now spent his mornings teaching troubled kids welding at a community center in Sedona, and his evenings sitting alone in a dark apartment because the silence was easier than explaining why he couldn't sleep with the lights off. And at the rear, covering their 6 out of habit that would never die, Marcus Bishop Tate, the oldest, the quietest, the one who had spent 11 months in a military hospital learning to walk again after a sniper round shattered his spine in a valley whose name was still classified. 5 broken men. 5 men the world had forgotten. 5 men who refused to forget each other. The bell above the diner door rattled when Forge pushed it open. Warm air hit his face, grease, burnt coffee, the faint smell of cinnamon from something baked hours ago. A woman in her 50s stood behind the counter, wiping a glass that was already clean. 2 truckers sat in a corner booth staring at their phones. A teenager with headphones mopped the floor near the restrooms with the enthusiasm of someone counting the minutes until their shift ended. The woman behind the counter looked up. Her eyes moved across the 5 men in their leather cuts. The patches, the road dust, the scars visible even in diner lighting. And her expression tightened for exactly 1 second before she forced a smile. "Sit anywhere, boys." They took the big booth near the window, The vinyl seats were cracked and repaired with duct tape. The table wobbled. Forge pressed his palm flat against the surface to steady it, and for a moment his hand just rested there, feeling the cold formica, feeling the years stacked inside his knuckles. "Same order?" Clutch asked. Nobody answered. Nobody needed to. 5 black coffees. 5 years of the same stop on the same night on the way back from the same cemetery where they visited the same empty headstone. Nathan Mercer, Staff Sergeant, Special Operations, killed in action, body never recovered. Forge closed his eyes. 25 years. 25 Veterans Days standing in front of a grave that held nothing but a folded flag and a lie. Nathan had been the best of them, the one who could make you laugh in a foxhole, the one who carried the wounded kid on his back through 3 clicks of hostile terrain without complaint, the one who carved 6 identical necklaces from salvaged titanium on the night before their final mission, one for each man, because he said if they all wore the same mark, then no matter what happened, no piece of any of them would ever truly be lost. 5 of them came home wearing those necklaces. Nathan didn't come home at all. The coffees arrived. Forge wrapped both hands around the cup and let the heat burn into his palms. Across the booth, Wrench was doing the thing he did when his anxiety was rising, tapping his index finger against the table in a rhythm only he understood. Fuse stared out the window at the rain. Bishop sat perfectly still with his eyes half closed, his breathing controlled, the way a man breathes when he's managing pain he'll never admit to. Clutch poured 3 sugars into his coffee and stirred slowly. 25 years, he said. Don't, Forge said. Sam, I'm just saying. I know what you're saying. Don't. Silence. The rain hammered the roof. The neon sign buzzed outside the window. The teenager with the mop disappeared into the back. Then the door opened. Not slowly. Not with the casual swing of someone coming in from the weather. It opened the way a door opens when someone pushes it with the last strength they have. Desperate, uneven, the hinges screaming. Cold air flooded the diner. Standing in the doorway was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, soaking wet. A thin jacket 2 sizes too big hung from her shoulders. Her sneakers were caked in red mud. Her hair, dark, tangled, matted, clung to her face like she'd been walking through the storm for hours, maybe longer. She was shaking, not from the cold, from something worse. Forge set his coffee down. The girl took 2 steps inside, then 3. Her eyes swept the diner with a wildness that Forge recognized immediately. He'd seen that look in combat zones, in refugee camps, in the eyes of children who had learned too young that the world was not a safe place and that the people who were supposed to protect them had already failed. The woman behind the counter came around the bar. Honey, where did you come from? Are you—" The girl didn't answer. She wasn't looking at the woman. She wasn't looking at the truckers, or the wet floor, or the flickering neon. She was looking at the booth, at the 5 men in leather, at Forge. No, not at Forge. At the chain around Forge's neck. The pendant was barely visible beneath his shirt collar. A sliver of hammered titanium, tarnished with age, threaded on a steel ball chain that hadn't been replaced since the night Nathan had pressed it into his hand in a bunker that smelled like cordite and blood. The girl raised her hand. Her fingers were red and trembling. Around her own neck, hanging from a length of paracord that was fraying at the knot, was an identical pendant. Identical. Same shape, same size, same hand-hammered surface, same imperfect edges that came from working metal with field tools in a war zone. Forge stopped breathing. Clutch's coffee cup froze halfway to his mouth. Wrench's finger stopped tapping. Fuse turned from the window. Bishop's eyes opened. My dad had that necklace, the girl said. Her voice was small, broken. A voice that had been screaming for days and had nothing left. Forge didn't move. Couldn't move. Because his brain was doing something it hadn't done in 25 years. It was running a serial number. The tiny engraving beneath the pendant's clasp, barely visible, almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. The sequence that each man had carved into his own piece using the tip of a bayonet. He reached up and pulled the pendant from beneath his shirt, turned it over. Read the sequence he had memorized a quarter century ago. Then he looked at the pendant hanging from the girl's neck. The engraving was different from his, but he recognized it. Every man in the booth recognized it, because there was only one person in the world who would have carved that specific sequence in that specific hand. The man who made all 6 necklaces. The man who insisted on a hidden mark beneath each clasp, a repair weld, a deliberate flaw, a signature no forger could replicate because it was born from a specific moment in a specific bunker during a specific firefight that no official record acknowledged ever happened. Nathan's mark, Nathan's necklace, on an 8-year-old girl standing in a diner in the middle of nowhere, Arizona in 2024. "That's not possible," Wrench whispered. Forge looked at the girl. His throat was dry. His hands were steady because he'd trained them to be steady, but something behind his ribs was shaking apart. "What's your name?" he asked. "Emma." She wiped her nose with the back of her hand. "Emma Cross?" "Emma." Forge's voice was low, careful, the way you speak to someone standing on the edge of something. "Where did you get that necklace?" "My dad gave it to me." Her chin trembled. "Before the bad men came." The woman behind the counter reached for a phone. "I'm calling the sheriff." "No!" Emma's voice cracked the room open. She stumbled backward, her eyes wide with a terror that was specific. Not general fear, specific. The kind of fear that comes from experience, from being brought to people in authority and being turned away. Or worse, being handed back. "The sheriff already told me I'm lying," she said. "He said my dad isn't real. He said my dad's papers are fake. He said I'm making it up." Forge looked at Clutch. The same thought passed between them without a word. It was a language they'd spoken for decades. Glances that carried the weight of full conversations. The woman hesitated, phone in hand. "Sweetheart, I have to call someone. You can't just—" "Ma'am?" Forge's voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. There was a quality to it, a quietness that was heavier than shouting, the kind of calm that comes from a man who has given orders in rooms where the wrong word gets people killed. "Give us a minute." The woman looked at him, looked at the patches on his cut, looked at the girl. Something in her expression shifted. Not trust exactly, but the recognition that whatever was happening in her diner was already beyond the reach of a phone call. She set the phone down. Forge slid out of the booth. His knee protested. He ignored it. He crouched in front of the girl until his eyes were level with hers. Up close, she looked worse. Dark circles under her eyes, a scrape on her left cheekbone that was 2 or 3 days old, chapped lips. The fingernails on her right hand were bitten down to nothing. "Emma," he said, "I need you to tell me about your dad. Can you do that? He told me to find men like you." She looked at his pendant. He said the necklace would tell them who he was. Behind Forge, Bishop spoke for the first time. His voice was deep, steady, eroded smooth by years of silence. "Ask her the name." Forge didn't want to, because if the answer was what the necklace said it was, then everything they'd believed for 25 years was a lie. Every memorial, every empty toast, every Veterans Day standing in front of a headstone that marked nothing. "Emma, what's your father's name?" "Nathan," she said. "His name is Nathan." The diner went silent. Not quiet. Silent. The kind of silence that has weight. The kind that presses against your eardrums. The kind that fills the space between heartbeats with something too big for the room. Clutch set his coffee cup down with a sound like a gunshot in the stillness. "That's not possible," Wrench said again, but this time his voice was different. This time it wasn't denial. It was a man standing at the edge of something he wasn't sure he could survive knowing. Forge stayed crouched. His knees screamed. He studied the girl's face, looking for something, anything, that would tell him this was a hoax, a mistake, a coincidence that could be explained away with logic and probability and the comfortable certainty that dead men stay dead. He found nothing. What he found instead was Nathan's jawline in miniature. The same slight asymmetry, the same dark eyes that looked older than the face they lived in. "She needs to eat," Fuse said quietly. He was already out of the booth, pulling a chair from a nearby table. "She needs dry clothes. She needs to sit down before she falls down." Forge nodded. He stood slowly, and as he rose, he did something he hadn't done in years. He took off his own jacket, the heavy leather cut with the club's patch, the one that smelled like road dust and engine oil and 2 decades of riding, and draped it around the girl's shoulders. She didn't flinch. Most people flinched when a man like Forge moved toward them, children especially. But Emma Cross didn't flinch. She leaned into the weight of the jacket the way a child leans into something that feels like safety. And that detail, that single, wordless detail, broke something in Forge's chest that he'd spent 25 years building walls around. They fed her. Soup, toast, orange juice. She ate like someone who hadn't eaten in days but was trying not to show it, taking careful bites, keeping her eyes moving, watching the door, watching the windows, watching for whoever she'd been running from. Between bites, she talked. Her father had raised her alone. They moved constantly, new towns, new names, never staying longer than a few months. He worked odd jobs, cash only. No paper trails. He taught her things no 8-year-old should need to know. How to hide, how to run, how to identify an exit in any building within 10 seconds of entering it. He told her almost nothing about his past. Just 2 things. 1, he had been a soldier. 2, he had brothers who thought he was dead. 4 days ago, men came to the house they were renting outside Winslow. 2 SUVs. Black. No plates. Her father woke her at 0300. She used that term, 0300, the way a child uses a word they've heard 1,000 times without understanding its origin, and put her out the back window. He pressed the necklace into her hand. "Find them," he said. "Find the men who wear this. Tell them Forge. Tell them Clutch. Tell them the names." He knew their names, their road names, names that existed nowhere in any official record, names that lived only inside the Brotherhood. Then the door was kicked in. She heard shouting. She heard her father's voice, calm, controlled, the voice of a man who had been waiting for this moment for years. She heard something heavy hit the floor. She ran. 4 days. Alone. An 8-year-old walking highway shoulders and sleeping under overpasses in November in northern Arizona, eating gas station crackers she stole from a display rack, hiding from every vehicle that slowed down, trusting no one. Until she saw 5 motorcycles parked outside a diner and recognized the shape of a pendant through a rain-streaked window. Forge sat across from her and felt the years collapsing. 25 years of guilt, of wondering what they could have done differently, of the mission report that said Nathan had been killed during extraction, his body lost in a tunnel collapse that sealed an underground complex in a country they were never officially in. They'd been told there was nothing to recover. They'd been told to move on. They'd been ordered to move on. "I need to make some calls," Forge said. He didn't look at anyone when he said it. He stood and walked to the corner of the diner near the ancient payphone that probably hadn't worked since 2008, and he pulled out a prepaid cell. Not his personal phone, the one the club used for conversations that didn't leave records. He called one number. Forge. The voice on the other end belonged to a man named Sullivan who worked in a federal building in Phoenix and owed the club a debt that could never be fully repaid. Something involving his teenage daughter, a trafficking ring, and 4 bikers who did in one night what 3 agencies had failed to do in 18 months. "What do you need?" Staff Sergeant Nathan Mercer, Special Operations, declared KYA 25 years ago. "I need his full jacket. Everything the military has." Silence on the line. Then, "That name's flagged." "Flagged how?" "Forge, that name is buried. I ran it once 2 years ago as a favor for a journalist. Got a visit from 2 men in suits within 48 hours. No agency identification, no business cards, just a conversation in a parking garage that made it very clear I should never run that name again." Forge looked back at the booth where Emma was finishing her soup. Clutch had moved to sit beside her. His massive frame dwarfed the child, but she'd leaned against his arm, and Clutch, the man who had once broken a man's wrist for reaching toward a gun near a playground, sat perfectly still so she could rest. "Run it again," Forge said. "You don't understand what you're asking." "I'm not asking." He hung up. When he returned to the booth, the 4 veterans were waiting. Emma had fallen asleep against Clutch's arm, her small hand still clutching the pendant around her neck. "It's him," Wrench said. Not a question. "The necklace is real," Forge said, "but the mark is his. The serial is his. Nobody alive could replicate that. Which means he's alive. Fuse's voice was flat, processing. The way soldiers process information that rewrites the last 2 decades of their lives. Which means he's alive, Forge confirmed. And someone took him. Again. Bishop leaned forward. The overhead light caught the long scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. Shrapnel, 2004, a valley in eastern Afghanistan that the Pentagon still denied any Americans had operated in. If Nathan's been alive this entire time, Bishop said slowly, then someone in our own government decided he needed to disappear. No one answered, because they all understood what that meant. It meant the headstone was a prop. The folded flag was theater. The condolence letter was a script. Every official who looked them in the eye and said, "We're sorry for your loss," was reading from a teleprompter of lies. It meant the system they had bled for, the country they had served, the chain of command they had trusted with their lives, had looked at one of their own and decided he was more useful erased than alive. Forge reached across the table and gently lifted the pendant from Emma's sleeping hand. He turned it over. The metal was warm from her skin. The hidden mark beneath the clasp was unmistakable. Nathan's signature weld, the tiny imperfection that was more precise than any machine could produce because it was born from muscle memory and a steady hand under fire. But there was something else, something he almost missed, a hairline seam along the edge of the pendant, so fine it could have been a manufacturing artifact. But Nathan didn't make artifacts. Every mark Nathan made was intentional. Every scratch, every groove, every imperfection was language. Forge pressed his thumbnail into the seam. The pendant's hollow casing shifted. Inside, recessed into a space no larger than a fingernail, was a micro-storage chip sealed in a thin layer of resin. Forge stared at it. "What is that?" Clutch asked. Forge didn't answer, because he was remembering something Nathan had said on the last night they were all together, in the bunker, while he carved the necklaces, the night before the mission that would erase him from the world. Nathan had looked up from the metal he was shaping and said, "If anything ever happens to me, if they ever try to bury what we saw, the proof will be where it always is, close to the heart." They'd thought it was poetry. Nathan talked like that sometimes. Soldier philosophy, foxhole wisdom. It wasn't poetry, it was instructions. Emma stirred in her sleep. Her hand reached for the pendant and found it gone. Her eyes flew open with a panic that was instant, total, and heartbreaking. The reflexive terror of a child who had been taught that losing that necklace meant losing everything. "It's here," Forge said. He placed it gently in her palm. "It's right here. Nobody's taking it." She closed her fingers around it and looked at him with Nathan's eyes. "Are you going to find my dad?" Forge looked at his brothers. Clutch, Wrench, Fuse, Bishop, 4 men who had already given more than any country had the right to ask. 4 men who were tired, broken, haunted by wars that wouldn't let them sleep, and a peace that never quite felt earned. 4 men who were already standing up. "Yeah," Forge said, "we're going to find your dad." Outside, the rain had stopped. The desert air was sharp and clean, the kind of cold that cuts through leather and settles in bone. Forge stepped onto the wet asphalt and looked at the sky. No stars, just clouds. Just darkness pressing down on the highway like a hand trying to smother something. His phone buzzed. Sullivan. 1 text message. No greeting, no context, just 6 words that changed everything. "Don't go home. They know already." Forge stared at the screen. The glow lit his face in the darkness. The scars, the stubble, the eyes that had seen too much and forgotten nothing. He looked back through the diner window. Emma was awake now, sitting up in the booth, Clutch's hand on her shoulder. She was watching Forge through the glass with an expression that no 8-year-old should know how to wear. She looked like a girl who understood that the men who had taken her father were already coming for her. And she was right. Because at that exact moment, 3 miles south on Route 89, a convoy of 4 black SUVs with no license plates and no headlights was cutting through the desert darkness at 90 miles an hour. Heading north. Heading toward a dying diner with a broken neon sign where 5 aging bikers had just made a promise they couldn't take back to a girl holding the only evidence that could unravel a conspiracy older than she was. And the men in those vehicles had orders that were very, very simple. Recover the necklace. Eliminate everyone who had seen it. Forge killed the screen and pocketed the phone in the same motion. His breath came out in a white cloud that dissolved against the black sky. 6 words. That's all Sullivan had sent. 6 words that meant the clock was already running, that whatever system had buried Nathan Mercer for a quarter century had just detected a disturbance in its machinery, and the response was already in motion. 3 seconds. That's how long Forge allowed himself to stand in the parking lot and feel the weight of what was coming. Then he moved. He pushed through the diner door hard enough to rattle the bell off its bracket. It hit the floor with a tinny sound that made Emma flinch in the booth. Clutch's hand tightened on her shoulder. Not restraining, steadying, the way you hold something fragile when the ground starts shaking. "We're leaving," Forge said. "Now." Clutch read his face. Didn't ask questions. He was already sliding out of the booth, one hand guiding Emma to her feet. The girl moved with a quickness that was practiced, muscle memory from years of midnight evacuations, from a childhood built on the understanding that the word now never came with a second chance. "What happened?" Fuse asked, already on his feet. "Sullivan says they know." "Know what? That we have her? That we're here?" "Both. Either. It doesn't matter." Wrench was pulling on his gloves. His hands were shaking again, but his jaw was set. "How much time?" Forge looked out the window at the empty highway. Dark. No headlights. But that meant nothing. Darkness didn't mean safety. Darkness meant you couldn't see what was already moving toward you. "Not enough." Bishop hadn't moved from the booth. He sat with his hands flat on the table, his eyes closed, his breathing measured. The other 4 knew this posture. Bishop was calculating, running distances, speeds, routes, contingencies, the kind of tactical arithmetic that had kept their unit alive through operations that were never supposed to succeed. "The 89 South is a straight line," Bishop said without opening his eyes. "If they're coming from Flagstaff, they'll have eyes on this stretch in minutes. We take the 89 North, we hit the reservation, narrow roads, no cell coverage, no cameras. We're putting 5 Harleys on reservation back roads in November in the dark with an 8-year-old passenger," Clutch said. His voice carried no judgment. Just the facts. Just the math of survival laid bare. "You got a better option?" Bishop opened his eyes. Clutch looked down at Emma. She was standing between his legs, her hand wrapped around 2 of his fingers. His hand could have closed around her entire forearm. Instead, those fingers stayed open, gentle, letting her hold on at her own strength. "No," Clutch said. "I don't." The woman behind the counter was watching them with the expression of someone who understood that whatever was happening was bigger than her diner, bigger than a phone call, bigger than anything the Coconino County Sheriff's Department was equipped to handle. Forge pulled $200 bills from his wallet and laid them on the counter. "You never saw us." She looked at the money, looked at the girl, looked at the men in leather who were heading for the door with the coordinated urgency of soldiers abandoning a position. "Never saw who?" she said. They were through the door in 8 seconds. The cold hit them like a wall. The rain had stopped, but the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees, and the desert air carried that mineral sharpness that cuts straight through fabric and settles against skin like a blade. Emma shivered inside Forge's oversized jacket, her small frame barely visible beneath the leather. "She rides with me," Clutch said. Not a question. "She rides with you," Forge confirmed. Clutch crouched beside the girl. His knees popped. His back protested. 47 years old, and he moved like 60, every joint carrying the accumulated debt of a body that had been broken and rebuilt too many times. "Emma, you ever ridden a motorcycle?" She shook her head. "Okay, here's what's going to happen. You're going to sit behind me. You're going to hold on tight, right here, around my waist. You don't let go, no matter what. You hear loud noises, you hold tighter. You feel scared, you hold tighter. You got it?" She looked at him with those dark eyes, Nathan's eyes, and said, "My dad taught me how to hold on." Something in Clutch's expression fractured, a crack so small that anyone who didn't know him would have missed it. But Forge saw it, Wrench saw it, they all saw it. Because that sentence, "My dad taught me how to hold on," was the kind of thing Nathan would have said. Nathan, who held on to everything. Nathan, who refused to let go of anyone. Nathan, who apparently held on for 25 years in whatever hole they'd buried him in. 5 engines roared to life simultaneously. The sound echoed off the diner's corrugated walls and rolled across the empty parking lot like controlled thunder. Forge led them out of the lot, north on 89, riding the center line because the shoulders were soft with rainwater and a slide at speed on a cold night would end the mission before it began. Emma pressed her face against Clutch's back and held on. Behind them, the diner's broken neon sign continued to blink its half-message into the darkness. OPN4HORS, a wounded word on a building that would forget them by morning. They rode for 40 minutes without stopping. The highway narrowed as they pushed into the high desert beyond Flagstaff's northern reach, the pavement cracking and patching, the white lane markings fading into suggestions. The elevation climbed. The air thinned. Forge's lungs burned and his knee locked on the shift peg twice, but he kept the throttle steady, kept the formation tight, kept checking his mirrors for headlights that weren't there yet. At a junction where the 89 split toward Cameron, Forge pulled off onto a gravel access road that led to an abandoned Forest Service fire station, a concrete block building with boarded windows and a rusted equipment shed that he'd used twice before when the club needed a place that didn't exist on anyone's map. He killed the engine. The silence that followed was enormous. Desert silence. The kind that hums in your ears because your brain can't accept the absence of sound. One by one, the others pulled in beside him. Clutch dismounted first, lifting Emma off the bike with the care of a man handling live ordnance. She was trembling, cold, exhaustion. The adrenaline crash that comes after sustained fear finally finds a pause. Inside, Forge said. The fire station's lock was rusted through. Bishop shouldered the door open. Inside, dust, dead leaves, a folding table, 3 metal chairs, and the remnants of a campfire someone had built on the concrete floor years ago. No electricity, no water, but 4 walls and a roof, and right now that was enough. Wrench produced a flashlight. Fuse found an old kerosene lantern on a shelf, and after 3 attempts coaxed a weak flame from its ancient wick. The light was amber and unsteady, throwing shadows that moved like living things across the concrete walls. Emma sat in one of the metal chairs with her knees drawn to her chest, Forge's jacket pulled around her like a shell. She watched the 5 men with an alertness that shouldn't belong to a child, tracking their movements, reading their body language, cataloging exits. Forge leaned against the wall and looked at his brothers. In the lantern light, they looked exactly like what they were. Aging soldiers at the end of their physical limits, running on nothing but loyalty and the stubborn refusal to let another brother disappear. "We need to talk about what we're doing," Forge said. "We're finding Nathan," Clutch said immediately. "That's the objective. I'm talking about the cost." Silence. "Someone ran that pendant serial before we got to it," Forge continued. "Sullivan says the name is flagged at a level that doesn't have a public acronym. 2 men visited him 2 years ago just for searching it. Now we've got an 8-year-old girl wearing the evidence around her neck, and whoever these people are, they mobilized within hours of her walking into that diner." "You think the diner was watched?" Fuse asked. "I think everything is watched when people like this are involved." Wrench was pacing near the door. His flashlight carved nervous arcs across the floor. "So what are you saying? We hand her over? We call the sheriff she already told us turned her away? We drop her at some CPS office where she becomes a case number? I'm saying we need to understand what we're walking into before we walk into it." "Nathan is alive." Clutch's voice was flat. A slab of granite dropped onto the table. "He's been alive for 25 years, locked up somewhere by people wearing our flag. And you want to have a strategy meeting. I want to keep us alive long enough to actually find him. You want to be careful." Clutch stood up from the chair he'd been leaning against. In the lantern light, his full height was something to contend with. 6'3", shoulders like a doorframe, hands that could crush a man's throat, but chose instead to hold a terrified child's fingers in a diner booth. "Careful is what we were 25 years ago, Forge. Careful is what got Nathan left behind." The words landed like a slap. Forge didn't flinch, but he felt them, every syllable. Because Clutch wasn't wrong. And that was the thing about Clutch. He was never wrong about the things that hurt. "That's not fair," Fuse said quietly. Fair? Clutch turned on him. Was it fair when we flew out on that bird and Nathan wasn't on it? Was it fair when they told us the tunnel collapsed and there was nothing to recover? Was it fair when we stood in front of an empty casket and pretended that folding a flag made it okay? Nobody pretended it was okay, Forge said. Then why didn't we go back? There it was. The question that had lived in all of them for 25 years. The question that sat at the bottom of every bottle Wrench had emptied. The question that woke Fuse at 0300. The question that kept Bishop silent for days at a time. Why didn't they go back? Because they told us he was dead, Forge said. Because we trusted the people who told us. Because we followed orders. And now we know those orders were lies. Yes. So what are we going to do about it? Forge looked at the girl. Emma was watching the exchange with an expression that was too calm, too composed for an 8-year-old watching grown men argue about her father's fate. She'd seen this before. Arguments about what to do. Arguments about risk. Arguments that ended with someone deciding she wasn't worth the trouble. He walked to her, crouched down again, his knee grinding. He looked into Nathan's eyes set in a child's face and said, "Nobody in this room is going to walk away from you. Do you understand that?" She studied him the way her father must have studied terrain, looking for deception, for the gap between what someone said and what they meant. "My dad said people always walk away," she said. "He said the ones who stay are the ones who've already lost everything." Forge felt something tear inside his chest, a wound he thought had scarred over decades ago, ripping open along its original fault line. He stood up and turned to his brothers. "Clutch is right. We don't get to be careful. Not this time." He pulled out the prepaid phone. "I need to see what's on that chip." "You need equipment for that," Wrench said. "If it's encrypted military-grade storage, you need hardware we don't have." "I know someone who does." Wrench stopped pacing. "No. Wrench, you're talking about Cora." The name fell into the room and changed its temperature. Fuse looked at the floor. Bishop's jaw tightened. Clutch crossed his arms. "She's the only person I trust with this kind of hardware," Forge said. "She's also the person who swore on her mother's grave that she would never speak to you again," Wrench said. "After what happened with Marcus." Forge didn't answer immediately. Marcus. His son. 23 years old, dead 18 months ago from an overdose in a motel room in Tucson. Cora had been Marcus's girlfriend. She'd called Forge twice before the end, begging him to intervene, begging him to come down from whatever mountain of stoic silence he'd built and actually be a father. He hadn't answered. Not because he didn't care, because he didn't know how, because the same skills that made him a leader in combat made him a disaster in every relationship that required vulnerability instead of control. By the time he called back, Marcus was already cold. Cora blamed him. She was right to. "She won't talk to me," Forge said. "She'll talk to the mission." "People aren't missions," Fuse said softly. "That's the problem. That's always been the problem." "Fuse, no, listen to me." Fuse stepped forward, and in the amber light, his face carried a weight that the others rarely saw, because Fuse kept everything below the waterline. "You lost Marcus because you treated him like an objective instead of a son. You treated his addiction like a tactical problem instead of a father's responsibility. And now you're about to walk into Cora's life and ask her to help you save someone else's child while yours is in the ground." Nobody moved. The lantern flickered. A gust of cold wind pushed through the gaps in the boarded windows and made the flame dance. Forge stood perfectly still. His face was stone. But his hands were shaking. Not the way Wrench's hand shook with the tremor of unmedicated anxiety. This was different. This was the tremor of a man holding something inside his chest that was too heavy for his skeleton to support. "I know what I did," Forge said. His voice was quiet, stripped, a voice with all the armor removed. "I know I failed Marcus. I know I failed Cora. I know I spent 20 years being a better sergeant than a father, and I know my son died wondering why I couldn't love him louder than I loved my silence." The room held its breath. "But Nathan is alive, and this girl is here, and I will carry the weight of Marcus for the rest of my life. But I cannot let another man's child lose her father because I was too broken to act." Emma watched him from the chair. She didn't understand every word, but she understood the tone, she understood the fractures in his voice. She understood, with the cruel intuition of a child who had grown up on the margins of something terrible, that the man standing in front of her was not whole, that none of them were whole, that what held them together was not strength, but the shared understanding that broken pieces, pressed tight enough, could still form a wall. Clutch uncrossed his arms. He looked at Wrench. Wrench looked at Fuse. Fuse looked at Bishop. Bishop, who had said almost nothing for the past hour, who had been sitting in the corner with his eyes half closed and his breathing controlled, processing everything the way Bishop processed everything, slowly, deeply, with the patience of a man who had learned to read the current before stepping into the river. Bishop stood. "Call Cora," he said. "I'll talk to her." Forge looked at him. "You?" "Marcus used to call me on Sundays." Bishop's voice was level. No accusation, no self-righteousness, just fact. "He talked about the things he couldn't talk to you about. I listened. I never told you because he asked me not to. But Cora knows. She knows I was the one he called when the darkness got too close." Another wound. Another piece of the past that Forge had never seen because he'd been too busy standing at the front of the formation to look at what was falling apart behind him. He handed Bishop the phone. Bishop dialed. Walked outside. The door closed behind him with a sound like a verdict. Forge sat down on the concrete floor with his back against the wall. He was 51 years old. He had titanium in his knee, shrapnel scars across his left shoulder, a dead son, a missing brother, and an 8-year-old girl with a dead man's necklace staring at him in lantern light like he was the last solid ground in a flooding world. The irony was not lost on him. He'd spent his whole life being the man people leaned on, the unshakable center of every formation, the voice that said move and men moved, the hand that said stop and the column halted. And inside that fortress of discipline, behind the walls of competence and command, was a man so terrified of his own tenderness that he'd let his son die rather than say the 3 words that might have saved him. 10 minutes passed. 15. The lantern burned low. Bishop came back inside. His face was unreadable. He handed the phone back to Forge. "She'll help," Bishop said. "But she wants to see you, in person, face to face." "Why?" "She said she needs to know if you've changed. She said she'll look in your eyes, and she'll know." "And if she decides I haven't?" Bishop didn't answer. He didn't need to. Forge stood, his knee locked. He gripped the wall and pulled himself upright with the slow determination of a man who had been getting back up his entire life. "Where is she?" "Sedona. She has a workshop in the basement of her house. She does forensic data recovery for defense attorneys. She's got the equipment." "That's 90 miles south," Wrench said. "Back toward Flagstaff. Back toward whoever's coming from that direction." "Then we go through Oak Creek," Bishop said. "Back roads, no highway." Forge looked at Emma. She had been watching Bishop the entire time he was on the phone. Now she was looking at Forge with an expression he couldn't decode. "What did Bishop mean?" she asked. "About your son?" The room went quiet. Forge opened his mouth, closed it. For a man who had commanded soldiers in combat, who had stared down enemy fire without blinking, the question from an 8-year-old girl unmanned him completely. "He meant that I made mistakes," Forge said finally. "Big ones." "Did you fix them?" "Some things can't be fixed, Emma. Some things you just carry." She considered this with the gravity of someone much older. Then she said, "My dad carries things too. He talks in his sleep. He says names. Your name." Forge felt the air leave his lungs. "He says your name and he says sorry." Nobody spoke. The lantern hissed. The wind pressed against the windows. Forge turned away because there are limits to what a man can absorb in front of others, and he had just reached his. "Mount up," he said. His voice was steady. His eyes were not. "We ride south. No stops. No headlights until we clear the ridgeline. We stay off pavement where we can." Clutch lifted Emma from the chair. She wrapped her arms around his neck automatically, the way a child does when being carried is the most natural thing in the world. Her fingers found his collar and held. They filed out into the night. The sky had cleared enough to show a scatter of stars through the breaking clouds. cold, distant light from dead suns that had no opinion about the 5 men and 1 child about to ride into the darkness below them. Forge mounted his Road King. The engine turned over with a sound like a controlled detonation, and for a moment the vibration traveled up through the frame, through the handlebars, through his gloves, and settled in his chest alongside everything else he was carrying. He thought about Nathan saying names in his sleep. He thought about his own son calling Bishop on Sundays because his father was too armored to answer. He thought about 25 years of folded flags and empty headstones, and the machinery of erasure that could swallow a man whole and leave nothing behind but a classified file and a lie. Then he pulled onto the gravel road, and behind him 4 engines followed, and behind them the desert swallowed the fire station back into its darkness as if they had never been there at all. 70 minutes later, they descended through Oak Creek Canyon on switchbacks so tight that Forge could hear the creek rushing somewhere below in the blackness, the sound of moving water mixing with the rumble of 5 engines and the whistle of cold air through the pine canopy. Emma hadn't loosened her grip on Clutch's waist since they'd left the fire station. Forge checked his mirror every 30 seconds. No headlights behind them, no headlights ahead. Nothing. Which worried him more than headlights would have. Cora's house sat at the end of a dirt road on the eastern edge of Sedona, backed against a sandstone ridge that glowed red in daylight, but at night was just a dark mass blotting out the stars. No porch light, no visible windows, just a mailbox, a gravel driveway, and a workshop door built into the hillside beneath the main structure. They killed the engines 50 yards out and walked the bikes in. Old habit, sound discipline. In a canyon at night, an engine carries for miles. The workshop door opened before they reached it. Cora stood in the frame. She was 31, thin, with short dark hair and eyes that looked like they'd been crying recently but would never admit it. She wore a flannel shirt over a thermal, work boots, and an expression that made it clear she had agreed to this under protest, and the protest was still active. She looked at Forge first, held his gaze for a long time, reading him the way she'd told Bishop she would, looking for something in his eyes that would tell her whether the man who had let her boyfriend die was capable of anything different now. Forge let her look. He didn't perform. He didn't soften his expression or harden it. He just stood there and let her see whatever was there. Then she saw Emma. The girl was standing behind Clutch, one hand gripping his belt, peering around his hip with those dark, too old eyes. Cora's face changed, not softened, shifted. The anger didn't leave, but something else moved in beside it. Something maternal and involuntary. Something that recognized a child in trouble the way the body recognizes a wound, automatically, without the permission of the mind. "Get inside," Cora said. "All of you." The workshop was a different world, clean, organized. 3 monitors on a steel desk, cables coiled with military precision, equipment racks along one wall holding hardware that Forge recognized from intelligence briefings he'd attended 15 years ago. Cora had built herself a forensic cave, and it was better equipped than most field offices he'd operated in. She knelt in front of Emma. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Emma Cross?" "Are you hungry, Emma?" "A little." Cora looked up at Forge. The anger in her eyes was still there, but now it was braided with something else. A question she wasn't ready to ask out loud. "There's food upstairs," Cora said to Clutch. "Take her up. Kitchen's on the right." Clutch nodded and offered Emma his hand. She took it, and they disappeared up a narrow staircase. Cora stood and faced Forge. The other 3, Wrench, Fuse, Bishop, stood along the wall like witnesses at a trial. "Show me what you have," Cora said. Forge placed the pendant on her workbench. The micro-storage chip glinted in the fluorescent light. Impossibly small, impossibly important. Cora picked it up with tweezers and held it under a magnifying lamp. She was quiet for a long time. Her jaw worked, her eyes narrowed. Then they widened. "This is military-grade encapsulated storage," she said. "I've seen this architecture exactly twice, both times in federal evidence recovery. This chip is designed to survive fire, water, electromagnetic pulse, and physical destruction up to 3,000 psi. Can you read it?" "I can try, but if it's encrypted, and it will be, I need a key, a passphrase, a biometric signature, something." Forge looked at Bishop. Bishop shook his head. Wrench, Fuse, nothing. They all turned toward the staircase. toward the girl who might be the only person alive who knew the key her father had hidden inside a necklace he'd carried through 25 years of imprisonment. And somewhere out in the darkness beyond Cora's workshop, in the canyons and mesas and vast empty corridors of the Arizona night, the convoy that had been heading toward a diner on Route 89 had found it empty, found the $100 bills on the counter, found the tire tracks heading north, and was now recalculating. Hunting. Closing the distance between erasure and the only evidence that could bring the entire machine crashing down. Emma knew the key. She didn't know she knew it. That was the genius of what Nathan had done. He'd hidden the passphrase inside a bedtime ritual so ordinary, so woven into the fabric of their nightly routine, that his daughter carried it the way she carried her own heartbeat. Without thinking. Without knowing. Cora asked her gently, sitting cross-legged on the workshop floor, while Emma ate a peanut butter sandwich on the bottom step of the staircase. "Did your dad ever say special words to you? Something he repeated? A phrase? A rhyme? Something he said every night?" Emma chewed. Thought. "He used to count with me, before bed. He said it was our secret code." "Can you tell me the code?" 7, 4, Alpha, 19, 6, November, 0, 2, Forge. The room stopped. Cora looked at Forge. Forge looked at the floor. His name. Nathan had built his name into the encryption key, had whispered it to his daughter every night for years, embedding it into her memory like stitching a thread into the lining of a coat, invisible, structural, impossible to remove without unraveling the whole garment. Forge. Of all the things Nathan could have used as an anchor, a date, a location, a military designation, he'd chosen the name of the man he trusted most, the man he'd been calling out in his sleep for 25 years. "That's an alphanumeric sequence," Cora said, already turning to her workstation. "Military format. 74 Alpha 196 November 02, followed by a text string. It's a modified ComSec key structure. Give me 20 minutes." She didn't need 20. She needed 11. The chip cracked open on her third monitor like a wound splitting under pressure. Files cascaded across the screen. Documents, photographs, audio recordings, video fragments, spreadsheets dense with numbers and names. Hundreds of files, maybe thousands, organized with the obsessive precision of a man who had spent decades imprisoned with nothing but time and the burning need to ensure that when the truth finally surfaced, it would be undeniable. Cora scrolled through the directory in silence. Her face, lit blue by the monitor, went from focused to confused to something that looked like nausea. "What is it?" Forge asked. She didn't answer immediately. She opened a document, read, opened another, read, opened a photograph and then closed it quickly, her hand moving to her mouth. "Cora." "It's a prison," she said. Her voice was different now, smaller. The anger that had armored her since they'd arrived was gone, replaced by something raw. An underground facility, decommissioned military infrastructure, communications bunkers, Cold War-era tunnel systems, repurposed, converted into a black site operated by a private military corporation. She turned the monitor so they could see. The photograph showed a concrete corridor lit by industrial fluorescence, cell doors on both sides, narrow, steel. The kind of doors designed not for security, but for erasure. Thick enough to swallow sound, heavy enough to seal a man away from the world as completely as if he'd never existed. "That's not a prison," Bishop said from the corner. His voice had changed. The measured calm was gone. In its place was something Forge had only heard twice in 30 years. A cold, grinding fury that came from the deepest part of Bishop's architecture, from the place where the sniper round had shattered his spine and the military had told him he'd never walk again. "That's a burial site for living people." Cora opened another file. A spreadsheet, names, dates, service numbers, military branches, deployment histories. "These are soldiers," she said. "Active duty, reserve, special operations, all officially listed as killed in action, missing in action, or deceased through non-combat incidents. Accidents, suicides, medical failures." She scrolled down. The list kept going. 27 names. 27 service members declared dead by the United States military between 1995 and 2019, all connected to operations that are still classified. "They witnessed something," Fuse said. They witnessed everything. Cora opened an audio file. Static. Then a voice. Male. Middle-aged. Bureaucratic. The kind of voice that signs forms and shreds documents and sleeps soundly. The recording was a conversation between two men discussing what they called asset containment protocols. The language was clinical, sanitized, but the meaning underneath was clear. Soldiers who had participated in or witnessed unauthorized operations, illegal weapons testing, unapproved chemical deployment, civilian casualties that were deliberately concealed, were being identified, extracted from their units, and disappeared into a facility operated by a corporation called Greystone Pacific Defense Solutions. Not killed, disappeared. Because dead men generate investigations, missing men generate searches, but men who are officially declared dead through verified military channels, complete with casualty reports, death certificates, flag ceremonies, those men simply stop existing. No investigation, no search, no questions. The perfect disappearance. Nathan saw something, Forge said. On our last mission. The one they told us was a communications installation raid. It wasn't communications, Bishop said. He'd moved closer to the monitor, his eyes scanning the files with an intensity that bordered on violence. I always knew it wasn't. The security was wrong. The layout was wrong. Communications installations don't have chemical containment chambers in the sublevel. You never said anything. I said it in my debrief. They told me I was mistaken. They told me the stress of the operation had affected my perception. They told me to accept the official narrative and move on. Bishop's jaw was rigid. 3 weeks later, Nathan was declared dead. The connection settled over the room like ash. Nathan hadn't died in a tunnel collapse. Nathan had seen the same thing Bishop had seen. And unlike Bishop, Nathan hadn't kept quiet during his debrief. Nathan had pushed. Nathan had demanded answers. Nathan had done what Nathan always did. He refused to let go. And they buried him for it. 25 years, Wrench said. He was standing near the door, his arms crossed, his body vibrating with a tremor that had moved from his hands into his shoulders. They kept him underground for 25 years because he wouldn't shut up about what he saw. They kept all of them, Cora said. 27 men, some for longer. The earliest entry on this list is 1995. That's 30 years. Forge reached past Cora and scrolled through the spreadsheet himself. His eyes moved down the names, soldiers he didn't know, from units he'd never served with, men who had been erased from their families' lives with the same clinical precision that had erased Nathan from his. Then he stopped. His finger hovered over the screen. Forge? Clutch was watching him from across the workshop. Forge didn't answer. He was reading a name on the list, a name that didn't belong to a stranger, a name he knew, a name that had been in his phone, in his contacts, in his life for the past 15 years. Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Hask. Ray Hask, the man who had been their commanding officer on the final mission. The man who had written the official report declaring Nathan killed in action. The man who had looked 5 grieving soldiers in the eye and told them their brother was gone and there was nothing they could do. Ray Hask was on the list, not as an operator, not as a conspirator, as a prisoner. Entry date, 2011, 16 years after Nathan's disappearance. Status, contained. Location, sublevel 3, cell 19. He's in there too, Forge said. His voice sounded like it was coming from somewhere outside his own body. Hask, our CO, the man who signed Nathan's death certificate. Bishop stepped forward and read the entry. His face went white, whiter than Forge had ever seen it, and Bishop had been pale since the day the surgeons put his spine back together. That doesn't make sense, Clutch said. Hask signed the report. Hask was part of the cover-up. Hask signed the report in 1999, Bishop said slowly. He was imprisoned in 2011, 12 years later. Which means he did what they told him, Cora said, her voice carrying the flat weight of someone assembling a picture she didn't want to see. He signed the false report. He played along. And then something changed. He became a liability. Maybe he developed a conscience. Maybe he tried to come forward. Maybe he just knew too much. So they buried him too, Fuse said. They bury everyone eventually. That's how a system like this survives. It consumes its own. Forge backed away from the monitor. He needed air, he needed space, he needed to stand somewhere that didn't feel like the walls were made of lies stacked floor to ceiling. He walked to the workshop door and pushed it open. The night air hit him like cold water. Sharp, clean, indifferent. Above the canyon ridge, the stars had multiplied. The sky was clear now, vast. The kind of sky that makes a man feel small in a way that has nothing to do with humility and everything to do with the realization that the universe does not care about your suffering. He stood there and breathed. 25 years. He'd visited Nathan's headstone every Veterans Day for 25 years. He'd poured whiskey on the grass in front of an empty grave. He'd spoken to a stone marker as if his brother were underneath it, when his brother was underneath something else entirely. Concrete and steel, and the machinery of a government that had decided certain truths were more dangerous than certain men. And Hask, who he'd trusted. Hask, who he'd defended in conversations with other veterans who questioned the official account. Hask, who he'd called a good officer at reunions and memorial dinners. Hask, who had lied to his face and then, years later, had been swallowed by the same lie. The betrayal wasn't clean. It wasn't a single act of treachery that could be held up and examined and judged. It was layered, stratified, a geology of deception built over decades, with each layer pressing down on the one beneath it, until the original truth was so deep underground that nobody remembered it was there. Except Nathan. Nathan remembered. Nathan documented. Nathan spent 25 years in a cell building the case file that was now glowing on Cora's monitor. Forge, Clutch's voice behind him, close. Yeah, there's more. Forge closed his eyes. Of course there was more. There was always more. That was the architecture of this kind of conspiracy. It didn't end. It expanded. It grew new rooms and corridors and sub-level chambers the deeper you went, and every door you opened revealed another door behind it. He turned and went back inside. Cora was standing now, away from her monitors, her arms wrapped around herself as if she were cold. But it wasn't cold in the workshop. The expression on her face was one Forge recognized from the mirror on mornings after the worst dreams. The look of someone who has just learned something that cannot be unlearned. I found the facility location, she said. It's in Nathan's files. GPS coordinates, blueprints, access protocols. Everything. Where? 87 miles east of here, beneath a decommissioned Air Force communications relay station in the Mogollon Rim. The surface structure was officially demolished in 2003, but according to Nathan's documentation, the underground complex was never decommissioned. It was expanded. How do you know his documentation is accurate? Because of this. She turned back to the monitor and opened a video file. The footage was grainy, low resolution, shot from what looked like a camera hidden inside a light fixture. It showed a concrete corridor, the same corridor from the photograph. A man walked through the frame. He was thin, gray-haired, wearing a jumpsuit that might have been orange once but had faded to something closer to rust. He moved with a limp that favored his left side, and even in the degraded footage, even through the grain and the poor angle and the 25 years of damage that time and imprisonment had carved into his body, Forge recognized him. Nathan Mercer. Alive. Walking. Carrying a stack of papers in hands that were bony and scarred. His face was a topographic map of suffering. Hollowed cheeks, deep lines, a beard that was more gray than dark. But his eyes. Even in the footage, even through the layers of digital compression, his eyes were the same. Alert, defiant. The eyes of a man who had been caged for a quarter century and had spent every single day of that captivity refusing to be broken. Forge watched the footage 3 times. He couldn't stop. It was like pressing on a wound to confirm it was real. The pain was the proof. He escaped, Cora said, 3 weeks ago. His files include a sequence of maintenance schedules, guard rotations, and structural vulnerability assessments. He planned it for years, maybe decades. He got out. He found Emma. She was in foster care in Winslow under a false identity, and he gave her the necklace. He knew they'd find him, Fuse said. He knew he couldn't stay free, so he put the evidence on his daughter and sent her to find us. He used his own child as a courier, Wrench said. The words came out harsh, and Wrench immediately regretted them. Forge could see it in the way his jaw clenched after the last syllable, the way his eyes darted to Emma's sleeping form on a cot Cora had set up in the corner of the workshop. The girl had finally surrendered to exhaustion. She slept with both hands wrapped around the pendant, her body curled into a shape that was designed to protect the smallest possible area. He used his child because she was the only person in the world they wouldn't think to check, Forge said, and because she was the only person in the world he trusted to reach us. The weight of that settled over them. The weight of a father who had spent 25 years planning for a moment of freedom that might last only hours, and who had used those hours not to run, not to hide, not to save himself, but to ensure that his daughter would carry the truth to the only people he believed would act on it. "We go tonight," Forge said. "Go where?" Wrench's voice cracked. "The facility. You want to assault an underground military installation with 5 middle-aged men on motorcycles. I want to get Nathan out. And the other 26? Forge looked at him. "All of them." Wrench started to say something, stopped, started again, stopped again. His hands were shaking badly now, both of them, the tremor visible even in the workshop's flat fluorescent light. Forge knew what was happening. Wrench's anxiety was spiking, the kind of spike that usually sent him to a dark room with a bottle and a television turned up loud enough to drown out the screaming in his head. But Wrench didn't leave. He stood there shaking and didn't leave. "We can't do this alone," Bishop said. 5 men against a private military installation. The math doesn't work." "The math never worked," Clutch said. "The math didn't work in Helmand. The math didn't work in that valley in Kunar. The math has never worked for us. That's not new." "This is different. We're not 25 anymore. My right hip is held together with surgical wire. Wrench can barely hold a weapon without—" "Say it," Wrench cut in. "Say it out loud, Bishop. Without what?" Bishop met his eyes. "Without your hands betraying you." Wrench looked at his shaking hands, held them up in the light, studied them as if they belonged to someone else. "These hands rebuilt the engine on Forge's first Road King in a rainstorm in a parking lot in El Paso," Wrench said. His voice was steady even though his hands were not. "These hands pulled a kid out of a drainage ditch in Kandahar while mortars were falling so close the heat singed my eyebrows. These hands shake every single day, and every single day they still do what I tell them to do." He lowered his hands. "Don't you dare count me out because of a tremor." Bishop held his gaze for a long moment, then he nodded, once. A soldier's nod, acknowledgement without apology. Cora had been watching the exchange from her workstation. Now she spoke. "You don't need to assault the facility. You need to survive long enough to get the evidence to federal investigators." "The evidence is on your screen," Fuse said. "Send it." "I can't. The files include location data, operational codes, personnel names. If I transmit this over any civilian network, they'll intercept it before it reaches anyone who matters. These people operate inside the intelligence infrastructure. They have access to the same surveillance tools that the government uses. The only way this evidence reaches the right hands is physically. In person. To someone with enough authority and enough distance from the military chain of command to act on it without being intercepted." "FBI," Forge said. "Maybe, but not just any field office. You'd need someone at a level where the political cost of suppressing it outweighs the political cost of acting on it." "Sullivan," Forge said. "He's connected to the Phoenix field office." "Sullivan already told you his name is flagged," Cora said. "If you bring this to Sullivan, you're walking it into a building that may already be compromised." The silence that followed was different from the silences that had come before. This one had a specific shape, the shape of a trap. They had the evidence, they had the location, they had the truth, and they had no safe way to deliver any of it. A phone buzzed, not the prepaid, Forge's personal phone, the one he never used for club business, the one whose number existed in exactly 12 contacts. He pulled it out. Unknown number. He answered. "Mr. Dalton?" The voice was male, calm, mid-40s, the kind of voice that wore a suit. "My name is not important. What's important is that you have something that belongs to my employer, and we'd very much like it returned." Forge's blood went cold. Not his road name, his real name, his legal name, the name on his driver's license and his VA medical records, and nowhere else. I don't know what you're talking about. The girl, Mr. Dalton, and the pendant. You've had them for approximately 6 hours. That's long enough. Forge looked at Cora. She was already moving, pulling cables from her workstation, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She mouthed, tracing the call. Here's what happens next, the voice continued. You bring the girl and the pendant to a location we will specify. You come alone. The girl will be placed in appropriate care. The pendant will be returned to its rightful owner, and you and your associates will go home and continue your lives as if tonight never happened. And if I don't? A pause. Measured. The pause of a man who is used to having this conversation and knows exactly how it ends. Mr. Dalton, you have a home in Camp Verde, a workshop behind the house where you restore motorcycles. You have a storage unit on Route 260 where you keep your late son's belongings, boxes you've never opened. You have a bank account at Arizona Federal with a balance of $14,312. You visit your son's grave on the 14th of every month. Each detail was a bullet, not threats, demonstrations, proof that the walls Forge had built around his private life were made of glass. Your associate Raymond Medina has a sister in Tempe with 2 children. Your associate Daniel Kowalski receives VA disability payments for PTSD and has an outstanding prescription for medication he hasn't refilled in 4 months. Your associate Tomas Reyes teaches welding to at-risk youth at a community center that receives federal funding that can be revoked with a single phone call. And your associate Marcus Tate, his name is Bishop. His name is Marcus Jerome Tate, and he had a spinal fusion at the Phoenix 5 Medical Center in 2006. And the surgeon who performed that operation is currently on a medical board whose oversight committee includes 2 people who work for my employer. The air in the workshop was gone, consumed, replaced by something toxic. You're not outlaws, Mr. Dalton. You're aging veterans playing at rebellion. You ride your motorcycles and visit your memorials and tell yourselves you're still soldiers. But you're not soldiers. You're civilians. And civilians cannot survive what happens next if you refuse this offer. Forge held the phone away from his ear for 1 second. He looked at the room, at Cora, frozen at her keyboard, at Wrench, whose tremor had stopped for the first time in years, his body too frightened to shake, at Fuse, standing rigid by the wall, at Bishop, whose face had become something carved from stone, at Emma, asleep on the cot, holding a dead man's necklace in hands that were too small for the weight they carried. He brought the phone back to his ear. You took my brother, Forge said. You buried him alive for 25 years. You stole his daughter. You erased him from every record, every database, every system that's supposed to account for the men and women who served this country. And now you're calling me on my personal phone at 2 a.m. to tell me I'm just a civilian. Silence on the line. You're right, Forge said. I'm not a soldier. Not anymore. Soldiers follow orders. Soldiers trust the chain of command. Soldiers believe the system works. He paused, felt the weight of every word before he released it. I stopped being that man the moment I found out the system buried my brother alive. He hung up. Cora pulled the phone from his hand and smashed it against the edge of her workbench. The screen shattered. She removed the battery and the SIM card and dropped all 3 pieces into a metal waste bin. They'll have the location from the cell tower ping, she said. Her voice was fast now, stripped of everything except operational urgency. We have 15 minutes, maybe less. Everyone up, Forge said. We're moving. Clutch was already lifting Emma from the cot. The girl woke mid-lift, her eyes snapping open with that practiced alertness that no child should possess. Are they coming? She asked. Clutch didn't lie to her. Yes. She nodded. She wrapped her arms around his neck and held on. Cora was pulling a hard drive from her workstation, disconnecting cables with the speed of someone who had rehearsed this evacuation in her mind 1,000 times. She shoved the drive into a waterproof bag along with 2 portable devices and a tangle of cables. I'm coming with you, she said. No, Forge said. That wasn't a question. That hard drive has the only complete copy of Nathan's files. You need me to access them. You need me to build the transmission package that gets this to federal investigators. And frankly, she looked at him with an expression that was equal parts fury and something that might have been the earliest, most reluctant form of respect. Frankly, you need someone in the room who isn't carrying 30 years of guilt and a death wish. Forge opened his mouth to argue. She's right, Bishop said. Forge closed his mouth. They moved. 6 adults and 1 child into the night, the cold air biting through every layer, the sound of their boots on the gravel driveway loud enough to make Forge wince. Cora's SUV sat next to the workshop entrance, a battered Jeep Cherokee with tinted windows and Arizona plates. Emma rides with Cora in the Jeep, Forge said. Clutch and Bishop in the Jeep. Wrench, Fuse, you're with me on the bikes. We run interference. Interference against what? Wrench asked. Forge looked south down the dirt road toward the canyon, listened. The night was quiet. Too quiet. No coyotes. No wind. The desert had gone silent the way it does when something large and dangerous is moving through it. Then he heard it. Engines. Not motorcycle engines. Vehicle engines. Multiple. Coming up the canyon road from the south. Moving fast. No headlights. Against that, Forge said. Wrench looked at Fuse. Fuse looked at Wrench. Something passed between them. Not words, not even a glance that carried specific meaning. Just the shared understanding of 2 men who had been in this exact position before, in other deserts, in other lives, and who knew that the next few minutes would determine whether they survived the night. 3 bikes, 1 Jeep, 1 child, 1 hard drive containing evidence that could expose a conspiracy that had consumed 27 lives over 3 decades. And somewhere in the darkness below them, closing fast, a force designed to ensure that evidence never saw daylight. Forge kicked his Road King to life. The engine roared and the sound bounced off the sandstone ridge and rolled down the canyon like a declaration, not of war, but of something older and more dangerous, a refusal to be erased. The Jeep's tires sprayed gravel like shrapnel as Cora threw it into reverse, swung the wheel hard left, and punched the accelerator north up the dirt road. Bishop rode shotgun with 1 hand braced against the dash and the other reaching back to steady Emma in the rear seat. Clutch had the girl pressed between his body and the door, his arm a barricade around her shoulders, his eyes locked on the side mirror where the darkness behind them was no longer empty. Headlights, 3 sets, maybe 4, sweeping up the canyon road like predator eyes opening in sequence. Forge didn't look back. He leaned into the Road King and opened the throttle, Wrench and Fuse flanking him on either side. 3 bikes cutting north through the darkness on a road that was more suggestion than surface. Packed earth, loose rock, the occasional patch of crumbling asphalt that caught the front wheel and tried to throw the handlebars sideways. Fuse, take the left fork when we hit the wash. Forge shouted over the engine noise, Draw them west! Wrench, stay on me! Fuse peeled off without a word. His taillight shrank into the desert like a red ember carried by wind, and a moment later Forge heard the pitch of pursuing engines split, at least 1 vehicle breaking from the convoy to follow the decoy. Good. 1 less behind them. Math that still didn't work but worked slightly better. The road climbed. The Jeep's headlights bounced ahead of them, illuminating pines and sandstone in stuttering flashes. Cora drove the way someone drives when the difference between the gas pedal and a coffin is measured in seconds. Controlled aggression, no hesitation, every turn taken at the exact speed where physics allows the vehicle to hold the road and not 1 mile per hour slower. Forge's phone was gone, smashed on Cora's workbench. He had no way to contact Sullivan, no way to reach anyone outside the 6 people in this convoy. They were running blind, running dark, running north through the Mogollon Rim country on roads that didn't appear on civilian GPS, with evidence that could reshape the entire defense establishment, burning a hole in a waterproof bag on the Jeep's back seat. The first shot came at mile 3. Not a gunshot, a tire. The Jeep's right rear blew with a sound like a baseball bat hitting a watermelon, and Cora fought the wheel as the vehicle lurched sideways, fishtailing on the dirt surface, the rear end swinging wide toward the tree line. "Hold on!" Cora screamed. The Jeep slid. Gravel hammered the undercarriage. Emma didn't scream, but she buried her face in Clutch's chest and held the pendant so tight her knuckles went white. Cora corrected, overcorrected, corrected again, and brought the vehicle to a grinding stop at an angle across the road, the blown tire flapping against the wheel well like a dying animal. Forge and Wrench pulled up alongside. The pursuing headlights were closer now, much closer, a quarter-mile back, maybe less, and closing fast on the straight section of road they'd just crossed. "Can you drive on it?" Forge asked. Cora was already out, crouching behind the Jeep, looking at the damage. "Not fast, not far. The rim will cut through in a mile." "Then we stop here." "Forge, we stop here." He killed the engine. The silence that followed was absolute for exactly 2 seconds before the sound of approaching vehicles filled it. Engines growling through the canyon, getting louder, getting closer. "Wrench, get behind the Jeep. Cora, take Emma and Bishop into the trees, north. Don't stop until you can't hear engines anymore." "And then what?" Cora's voice was sharp, afraid, not for herself. "Then you find a phone and you call every federal number you can think of. FBI, DOJ, the Inspector General, Congressional Oversight. You call until someone answers who isn't part of this. That could take hours. Then it takes hours. We'll buy you hours." Bishop was already out of the Jeep, pulling Emma from the back seat. The girl looked at Forge with those dark eyes, Nathan's eyes, and said nothing. She didn't need to. Everything she needed to say was in the way she held the pendant against her chest, pressing it into her sternum as if she could absorb it into her body where no one could ever take it. "Go," Forge said. Cora grabbed the waterproof bag with the hard drive. Bishop took Emma's hand. The three of them moved into the tree line, Cora's flannel shirt disappearing between the pines, Bishop's broad frame swallowed by shadow, Emma's small silhouette vanishing last, a flicker of movement, and then nothing. Gone. Forge turned back to the road. 2 men, 2 motorcycles, 1 disabled Jeep, and 3 vehicles full of professionals whose job was to make evidence and the people carrying it cease to exist. "This is insane," Wrench said. He was crouched behind the Jeep's hood, his hands shaking, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. 2 of us against, 12? 15? "We're not trying to win," Forge said. "We're trying to be loud, loud enough and long enough for Bishop to get that girl to safety." "How long?" Forge didn't answer, because the honest answer was, as long as it takes, even if that means everything. The first SUV came around the bend at speed. Black. No plates. The kind of vehicle that exists in fleet inventories under budget line items that nobody audits. Its headlights swept across the disabled Jeep, across the 2 motorcycles parked at angles behind it, across 2 men in leather cuts standing in the road like a barricade made of scar tissue and stubbornness. The SUV stopped. 40 yards out. A second vehicle pulled up behind it. Then a third. Doors opened. Men stepped out. Forge counted. 6 from the first vehicle, 4 from the second, 3 from the third. 13 men in tactical black moving with the fluid coordination of people who train together, who operate together, who have done this kind of work often enough that it has become routine. 13 against 2. One of them walked forward, tall, lean, a bearing that said military, but a haircut that said private sector. The transition that happens when someone trades a uniform for a salary with more zeros and fewer rules. He stopped 20 feet from Forge and stood with his hands at his sides, relaxed, confident, a man who knew the arithmetic of this encounter and found it boring. "Mr. Dalton," same voice from the phone call, calm, professional. The voice of a man who scheduled violence the way other people scheduled meetings. "I really hoped you'd be more reasonable." "I'm extremely reasonable," Forge said. "You've just never met the version of me that runs out of patience." "Where's the girl?" "Gone." "Gone where?" "Away from you. That's all that matters." The man looked at the tree line, then back at Forge. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes recalculated. "We'll find her. You know that. A child, an injured man, and a woman with a laptop can't outrun us. They can barely outrun the cold." "Maybe, but every minute you spend talking to me is a minute they're putting distance between themselves and you. That's your strategy? Stalling? My strategy is standing in this road until you move me. And I promise you, moving me is going to cost more than you budgeted for tonight." The man studied him. For the first time, something like genuine curiosity crossed his face. Not respect, curiosity. the way a technician examines an anomaly in a system that's supposed to be predictable. "You're 51 years old," the man said. "You have a titanium rod in your right knee and nerve damage in your left hand from a blast injury in 2005. Your associate has a documented anxiety disorder and a tremor that makes him a liability with any weapon more precise than a shotgun. You are two broken men standing in a road in the middle of nowhere at 3 in the morning, and you are telling me you're going to stop 13 operators who have body armor, night vision, and orders that include lethal force authorization." Forge looked at Wrench. Wrench looked at Forge. Something passed between them. Not a plan, not a strategy. Something older. Something that lived in the space between soldiers who had bled together so many times that their blood types were academic. They were the same blood, the same body, the same organism that just happened to walk around in two separate skins. "Yeah," Forge said. "That's what I'm telling you." Wrench moved first, not toward the operators, toward the motorcycles. He swung onto his heritage softail and kicked the engine to life, the sound erupting into the canyon like a war drum, the vibration shaking the ground beneath their feet. Then he aimed the bike directly at the space between the first and second SUVs and twisted the throttle to the stop. The bike leaped forward. The operators scattered. Training takes over. You don't stand in front of a 1,000-pound projectile traveling at 50 miles per hour, no matter how well armed you are. Bodies dove left and right. The lead operator threw himself against his own vehicle. Wrench threaded the gap between the SUVs with inches to spare on either side, his handlebars clipping the mirror off the second vehicle, and disappeared down the road behind the convoy, engine screaming. 3 operators sprinted for the third SUV. Wrench had just become a target they couldn't ignore. A man on a loud motorcycle heading south toward civilization, toward cell coverage, toward anyone who might answer a call for help. 10 against 1. Better math. Forge didn't waste the opening. He moved to the Jeep's passenger side and reached under the seat where Bishop had been sitting. His hand found what he'd hoped Bishop had left, a Mossberg 5.9 pump action, the one Bishop kept in every vehicle he rode in because Bishop believed that preparedness was not paranoia, but a moral obligation to the people who depended on you. He racked the slide. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, that distinctive metallic chunk that has no translation but carries its meaning in every language. 7 of the remaining operators froze. 3 kept moving, fanning out toward the tree line in the direction Bishop had taken Emma and Cora. "You shoot one of us," the lead operator said from behind his SUV, "and this becomes a murder investigation. You go from concerned veteran to domestic terrorist in one trigger pull. And you go from whatever ghost budget you operate under to a very public crime scene with shell casings, DNA, and a whole lot of questions that Greystone Pacific doesn't want asked." The name landed. The lead operator's composure cracked. A hairline fracture, visible for only a second before he sealed it. But Forge saw it, and the operator knew he saw it. "You don't know what you're involved in." "I know exactly what I'm involved in. 27 soldiers buried alive in a hole in the Mogollon Rim because they saw things your employer didn't want seen. I know their names. I know their service numbers. I know the dates they were erased, and right now every single file is walking through those trees on a hard drive headed toward people who will not bury it." Silence. The kind of silence that recalibrates. The operator reached for his radio, spoke quietly. Forge couldn't hear the words, but he could read the body language. The tension in the jaw, the stiffness in the shoulders, the way a man stands when he's receiving orders he knows will make the next hour very ugly. The radio conversation ended. "New instructions," the operator said. His voice was different now. The professional veneer was peeling. Underneath was something colder, something that had stopped pretending this was a negotiation. "The girl is primary. The evidence is primary. Everything else is acceptable loss." Acceptable loss. The phrase they'd used to describe Nathan 25 years ago. The phrase they used to describe 27 soldiers. The phrase that turned human beings into accounting entries. 3 operators moved toward the tree line. Fast, coordinated, night vision goggles down, weapons up. Forge stepped into their path. He didn't raise the shotgun. He held it at his side, one hand on the grip, the barrel pointing at the ground. A man standing in a road. That's all. Just a man standing in a road who refused to move. "You'll have to go through me." That can be arranged. Then arrange it. And when you do, ask yourself how you explain the body of a decorated combat veteran on a forest road in Arizona to whatever oversight committee eventually audits your operation. Because that evidence is already out there. And killing me doesn't delete it. It just adds my name to the list of people you couldn't silence. Hesitation. Not from conscience, from calculation. The operator was running cost-benefit analysis the way a machine runs code, and the variables had shifted. Forge alive was a problem. Forge dead was a different kind of problem. Forge dead on a road where evidence had already been extracted was a problem that multiplied. The three operators heading for the tree line stopped, waited for instruction. And in that hesitation, in that narrow gap between decision and action, the sound came. Not from the road, not from the canyon, from above. A helicopter. Not the thudding roar of a military Black Hawk or the smooth hum of a corporate bird. This was different, heavier. The distinctive deep blade chop of a federal law enforcement helicopter. The sound that every operator in the field recognizes because it means the game has changed, the arena has expanded, and the rules are no longer written by the people on the ground. A searchlight punched through the darkness and pinned the road in a circle of white so bright it turned night into a surgical theater. Every shadow vanished. Every operator was suddenly visible, exposed, cataloged, recorded by whatever camera system was mounted on the aircraft above. Then a second helicopter. East. Coming fast. Then ground vehicles. Not SUVs, sedans. Dark blue. Moving up the canyon road from the north with lights flashing in patterns that said federal, that said jurisdiction, that said whatever authority you thought you had just got superseded. Sullivan. It had to be Sullivan. Forge didn't know how. The man's number had been on the prepaid that was now smashed in Cora's workshop, and Forge hadn't been able to call him since. But Sullivan was a man who understood that when someone tells you, don't go home, they know already. The next move isn't to wait for a callback. The next move is to activate every contingency you have and point them at the last known location of the people you warned. Or maybe it was Fuse. Fuse, who had peeled off as a decoy an hour ago. Fuse, who carried a second prepaid that Forge had forgotten about. Fuse, who had been quiet all night but who always had a backup plan running underneath the conversation that everyone else was having. The lead operator looked at the sky. Looked at the approaching vehicles, looked at Forge standing in the road with a shotgun at his side and an expression that said, I told you this would cost more than you budgeted. Stand down, the operator said into his radio. His voice was dead, the voice of a man watching his exit strategy collapse in real time. All units stand down. The three operators near the tree line lowered their weapons. The 7 on the road stepped back toward their vehicles, not surrendering, repositioning, calculating. These were professionals, and professionals know when an operation has failed and the only remaining objective is extraction. But they were too late. The blue sedans arrived first, doors opened, men and women in windbreakers with 3-letter acronyms on the back emerged with weapons drawn in authority that filled the canyon like concrete fills a mold. Federal agents, nobody moves. Nobody moved. Forge set the shotgun on the ground, slowly, hands visible. He was a 51-year-old man in a leather cut standing in the middle of a federal tactical response. And the last thing he needed was to become a headline about a biker who got shot during a raid because someone misread his intentions. The lead operator raised his hands. His men followed. Professionals to the last. They knew the arithmetic of surrender, the same way they knew the arithmetic of violence, and right now the numbers favored compliance. An agent approached Forge. Mid-30s, hard eyes, the kind of face that had been briefed on something enormous in the last 2 hours and was still processing the scale of it. Wade Dalton? Yeah. We received an emergency data transmission 40 minutes ago, routed through a Department of Justice secure server. It contained files related to an unauthorized detention facility operated by a private military contractor. The transmission was accompanied by a statement from a woman named Cora Vasquez identifying you as the source of the evidence. Cora. She'd done it. Somewhere in those trees, running through the cold with a laptop and a hard drive and an 8-year-old girl, she'd found a way to transmit. A cellular signal from a ridge, A satellite link. Something. Cora, who had every reason to hate Forge, who blamed him for her boyfriend's death, who had looked into his eyes and found just enough change to justify helping him, she'd gotten the evidence out. "Where's the girl?" the agent asked. "In the woods, north, with 2 of my people." The agent spoke into his radio. Teams moved into the tree line. Forge stood in the center of the road, surrounded by federal vehicles and helicopter searchlights and the dismantled remains of a conspiracy that had operated in silence for 30 years, and he felt nothing. Not relief, not triumph, not satisfaction, just an enormous emptiness that comes after sustained terror finally releases its grip and the body hasn't yet figured out what to replace it with. Then Wrench appeared, coming up the road from the south on his Heritage Softail, engine rumbling at idle speed, weaving between the parked federal sedans with the casual skill of a man who could ride a motorcycle through anything. He stopped beside Forge and killed the engine. His hands were shaking. His face was grinning. "I led them on a 14-mile chase through the canyon," Wrench said. "Blew out a headlight on a low branch. Almost went off a cliff twice. Hit a deer, Forge, at 60 miles per hour in the dark. Bounced off my front fender like a pinball." He held up his trembling hands. "Still shaking, but the bike's still running." Forge looked at him. And despite everything, despite the exhaustion, the fear, the decades of accumulated damage that each of them carried like geological strata, he almost smiled. 20 minutes later, they found them. Bishop emerged from the tree line carrying Emma. The girl was awake, alert, her arms around his neck, the pendant clutched in her right hand. Cora walked behind them, the waterproof bag over her shoulder, her face drawn and pale, but her eyes sharp with the particular intensity of a woman who has just done something that mattered. "She didn't drop it," Bishop said. "Not once, the whole way through the woods. Running, climbing, crawling under deadfall. She held that necklace like it was the only real thing in the world." Emma looked at Forge from Bishop's arms. "Did you find my dad?" she asked. Forge felt the question hit him like a round to the vest. Absorbed, but not painless. "Not yet," he said. "But we know where he is." He turned to the federal agent. "The facility is 87 miles east, under a decommissioned relay station on the Mogollon Rim. Underground, multiple sublevels, 27 prisoners, possibly more. One of them is Staff Sergeant Nathan Mercer, officially declared KYA in 1999. The agent stared at him. "You're telling me there's an active black site on domestic soil?" "I'm telling you there are 27 American soldiers buried alive under the Arizona desert, and every second you stand here processing that information is a second that the people running that facility have to destroy the evidence and move the prisoners." The agent reached for his radio. Forge watched him speak. Watched the words travel up through the chain of command, from the canyon road to the field office, to the regional director, to whoever sits at the level where decisions about things like this are made. Decisions that involve tactical teams and warrants, and the kind of operational authority that doesn't exist in the normal bureaucratic playbook, because the normal playbook was never designed for a scenario where the United States government has to raid itself. He turned back to his brothers. Clutch, Wrench. Fuse, who had appeared 15 minutes after the federal teams arrived, his bike caked in mud and his face carrying the satisfied exhaustion of a man who had done exactly what he'd set out to do. Bishop. 4 men standing in a searchlit road in the middle of the Arizona wilderness, wearing leather and road dust and the invisible weight of a night that had broken every assumption they'd carried for 25 years. "Nathan's in that hole," Forge said, "and I'm going to be there when they pull him out." "We're all going to be there," Clutch said. Nobody argued. Nobody hesitated. Nobody counted the cost because the cost had already been paid. 25 years of it, compounding daily, interest accruing on a debt that was never supposed to come due. The federal convoy formed 30 minutes later, 12 vehicles, 2 helicopters, a tactical team that moved with the grim precision of people who had been briefed on something that made them angry in ways they weren't trained to process. Forge rode at the rear of the convoy on his Road King, Wrench beside him, Fuse on the other side. Clutch drove the replacement vehicle they'd been given, a federal SUV with Emma buckled in the back seat, her hand pressed against the window, watching the desert pass in the pre-dawn darkness. Bishop rode with the tactical team. He'd spoken to the team leader for 3 minutes, showed him the scars on his back from the spinal surgery, told him about the valley in Afghanistan, told him about Nathan, told him about the 27 names. The team leader had looked at his men. His men had looked back. And without a vote, without a discussion, without anything except the silent consensus of soldiers who had just learned that the uniform they wore had been used to bury men alive, they'd made room for Bishop in the lead vehicle. Because some debts are paid by the people who inherit them. And these soldiers had just inherited a debt that was 30 years overdue. The convoy moved east through the pre-dawn desert, and behind them the sky began to lighten along the horizon. A thin line of gray pressing against the darkness, the first suggestion of a dawn that would arrive whether the world was ready for it or not. And 87 miles ahead, beneath a demolished relay station on a ridge that overlooked 100 miles of empty wilderness, 27 men sat in concrete cells and waited for a morning they had stopped believing would come. The convoy reached the relay station at 0547, 17 minutes before sunrise. From the road, it looked like nothing. A concrete pad cracked by decades of weather, chain-link fencing with faded government signage. The skeletal remains of a communications tower that had been cut at the base and left to rust where it fell. Scrub brush and juniper had reclaimed most of the surface, growing through the cracks in the concrete, turning the decommissioned site into something that looked like it had been forgotten by every agency that ever had authority over it. That was the point. The tactical team leader, a man named Hargrove, with a jaw like a shovel blade and eyes that had been briefed on things he was still trying to believe, stepped out of the lead vehicle and studied the site through binoculars. Dawn was coming. The eastern horizon had shifted from gray to a pale amber that crawled across the desert floor like spilled paint. "I don't see an access point," Hargrove said. Bishop was standing beside him. He'd been quiet for the entire drive, processing, calculating, running the same mental arithmetic he'd been running since the night began. Now he pointed. "Northeast corner, beneath the tower base. Nathan's blueprints show a maintenance hatch concealed under a false drainage grate. Standard Cold War-era design, built to survive a direct nuclear strike, accessible only if you know exactly where to look." Hargrove looked at him. "How reliable is this intelligence?" It was compiled by a man who spent 25 years as a prisoner inside that facility. He documented everything: guard rotations, structural layouts, ventilation pathways, emergency protocols. He had nothing but time and the kind of anger that doesn't burn out. It sharpens. Hargrove absorbed this, nodded, turned to his team. Forge watched from 30 yards back, standing beside his road king. Wrench and Fuse flanked him. Clutch sat in the Federal SUV with Emma, the engine idling, the girl's face visible through the window, pale, alert, her hand pressed flat against the glass, as if she could reach through it and pull her father out of the ground by force of will alone. The tactical team moved in formation. 12 operators in body armor flowing across the concrete pad like water through a broken dam. Fast, precise, silent. They reached the northeast corner. 2 men cleared the debris. A third found the drainage grate, rusted, heavy, bolted with hardware that looked original but wasn't. The bolts had been replaced recently, within the last month. Nathan's escape route. He'd loosened them on his way out. The grate came up. Beneath it, a steel-lined shaft dropped into darkness. A ladder rungs descended into a space that smelled like recycled air and old concrete and something else. Something human and stale. The smell of bodies living in a space that was never designed for habitation. Hargrove's team went down first. Radio silence for 4 minutes. 4 minutes during which Forge stood in the growing dawn light and felt every second like a needle pushed slowly through the center of his palm. Then the radio crackled. "We're in. Multiple levels, multiple cells. We have live occupants. Repeat. Live occupants. Medical teams to the access point immediately." Forge closed his eyes. His hands gripped the handlebars of his bike so hard the leather creaked. 25 years. 25 years of visiting an empty grave and talking to a headstone and pouring whiskey on grass that covered nothing. And now, a voice on a radio saying live occupants, and the world tilting on its axis so hard that Forge could feel the rotation in his bones. The next hour was controlled chaos. Medical teams descended into the shaft carrying equipment designed for confined space rescue. Generators were set up on the surface to power lighting rigs that illuminated the underground complex for the first time in decades without the facility's own electrical system. Federal evidence teams arrived in a second convoy, vans loaded with forensic equipment, photographers, document specialists. The entire apparatus of institutional accountability mobilized at a speed that suggested someone very high in the chain of command had read Nathan's files and made a decision that could not be walked back. Prisoners began to emerge. The first was a man in his 60s, thin, gray, blinking against the dawn light with the confused, damaged expression of someone who hasn't seen the sky in years. He was wearing a faded jumpsuit. His hands were shaking. A paramedic wrapped a blanket around his shoulders and guided him to a waiting ambulance, and the man kept turning his head, looking up, looking at the sky, looking at the color of the light as if he'd forgotten that the world had color. Then another, and another. They came up one at a time. Men in their 40s, 50s, 60s. Soldiers. All of them. You could see it in the way they held their spines straight, despite the weakness, the way their eyes scanned the perimeter despite the disorientation, the way they walked, despite bodies that had been confined in spaces too small for walking. They were damaged, diminished, broken in ways that would take years to understand, but they were alive. Forge counted them as they emerged. 7, 11, 15. Each face he searched for Nathan. Each face was a stranger. 19, 22, 25. Wrench was standing beside him now, Fuse on the other side. Clutch had left the SUV and was standing with Emma in his arms, the girl's eyes fixed on the shaft entrance with an intensity that was physical. Her entire body leaning forward, straining toward the hole in the ground, as if she could will her father up through it by the sheer force of her need. 26. Not Nathan. 27. Not Nathan. Forge's stomach dropped. The count matched the spreadsheet. 27 prisoners, all accounted for. But Nathan... "Sir," Hargrove's voice on the radio, "we've got one more, sub-level 4. He's in bad shape. He won't let us move him." "Why not?" "He says he's not leaving until someone named Forge comes down." Forge was at the shaft entrance before the transmission ended. He grabbed the ladder rungs and descended, his knee grinding, his left hand numb where the nerve damage turned his grip into guesswork, his boots ringing against the metal rungs with a sound that echoed down the shaft like a heartbeat amplified. The underground facility was exactly what Nathan's files had described. Concrete corridors lit by emergency strips. Cell doors, some open now, emptied. The cots and thin blankets inside them, arranged with the compulsive neatness of men who had nothing to control except the geometry of their confinement. The air was thick, warm, recycled so many times it tasted like it had been breathed by 100 lungs and never refreshed. Forge followed the corridor to a stairwell, down another level, another corridor. The lighting here was worse. Half the strips were dead, casting the passage in alternating bands of cold white and absolute darkness. The walls were sweating condensation. Somewhere behind the concrete, he could hear the hum of machinery, ventilation systems, water pumps, the mechanical heartbeat of a facility that had been designed to keep its contents alive indefinitely without ever acknowledging they existed. Sublevel 4. The last corridor, the deepest point. 2 tactical operators stood outside an open cell door. They stepped aside when Forge approached. One of them, a young man, early 30s, built like a welterweight, had an expression on his face that Forge recognized. Not shock, not anger, something more quiet and more permanent. The expression of a man who has just seen something that has changed his understanding of what one human being is capable of doing to another. Forge stepped through the door. The cell was 8 feet by 6. Concrete floor, concrete walls. A steel cot bolted to the wall. A steel sink. A steel toilet. No window, no clock, no calendar. Nothing that connected this space to the passage of time or the existence of a world beyond its walls. Nathan Mercer sat on the cot. He was 53 years old. He looked 70. His hair was gray-white, cut close to his skull. His face was a landscape of damage. Hollowed cheeks, deep lines carved by years of fluorescent light and recycled air, a scar across his forehead that was surgical and precise and told a story Forge didn't want to hear yet. His hands were in his lap. They were scarred, calloused, the hands of a man who had spent decades with nothing to do but document his own erasure using whatever materials he could steal, smuggle, or improvise. But his eyes were Nathan's. Dark, clear, defiant. The same eyes that had looked at Forge across a bunker 25 years ago and said, "If anything ever happens to me, the proof will be where it always is, close to the heart." Forge stood in the doorway and couldn't move. His body, the body that had been trained to move through combat, to function under fire, to operate in environments where hesitation killed, refused to cross the 3 feet of concrete between the door and the cot. Because crossing that distance meant it was real. It meant Nathan was alive. It meant the grave was empty, and the flag was theater, and the condolence letter was a lie. And the 25 years of guilt that Forge had carried like an iron lung were built on a foundation of manufactured falsehood. Nathan looked up at him. "You got old," Nathan said. His voice was ruined, rough, eroded by years of disuse and bad air, and the particular kind of silence that comes from being locked underground so long that speaking feels like an act of defiance against the architecture itself. "You got ugly," Forge said. Nathan's mouth moved. Not a smile. The muscles had forgotten how, but the ghost of one. The memory of a reflex that belonged to a younger man in a different century. "Is she safe?" Nathan asked. "She's safe. She's upstairs. Clutch has her." Nathan's eyes closed. His shoulders dropped. The tension that had been holding his body upright, holding it upright for weeks, maybe months, maybe years, released all at once, and he slumped forward on the cot like a marionette whose strings had been cut. Forge crossed the 3 feet. He sat on the cot beside Nathan. The steel frame protested under their combined weight. The mattress was thin enough that he could feel every weld, every bolt, every cold metal joint. He put his arm around his brother. Nathan leaned into him. Not dramatically, not with the cinematic weight of a reunion scene designed to make audiences weep. He leaned into him the way a man leans into a wall when he's been standing for 25 years and his legs have finally given out. Quietly. Completely. Without reservation. They sat like that for a long time. Then Nathan said, "I heard you. Every Veterans Day. In my head. I could hear you standing at that empty grave, talking to me. I knew you were there. I could feel it through the concrete." Forge didn't trust his voice. He tightened his arm. "I built the files because of you," Nathan continued. "Because I knew if I could get them out, you'd know what to do with them. You were always the one who knew what to do." "I didn't know what to do about Marcus," Forge said. Nathan was quiet for a moment, then, "Bishop told me, in letters, we had a way, a guard who owed me. Once a year. 1 letter in, 1 letter out. Bishop told me about your boy." Forge stared at the opposite wall. 8 feet of concrete. The boundary of Nathan's world for 25 years. Every crack, every stain, every imperfection in the surface. Nathan had memorized them all. Had spent decades looking at this wall and thinking about the people on the other side of it. "I'm sorry about Marcus," Nathan said. "I'm sorry about everything," Forge said. Nathan shook his head, slowly. The movement of a man for whom even small gestures require conscious effort. "You came. That's what matters. I sent my daughter into the dark with a necklace and a prayer that wasn't a prayer, just a name. Your name. And you came." Forge helped him stand. Nathan's left leg barely functioned. The limp Forge had seen in the surveillance footage was worse in person. A structural failure in the hip that made every step a negotiation between willpower and anatomy. They moved through the corridor together, Forge supporting Nathan's weight on his left side, the two of them navigating the passages like soldiers moving through hostile terrain, slow, deliberate, covering each other. At the base of the shaft, Nathan looked up. The ladder. 40 feet of vertical steel between him and the sky. "I can't climb that," he said. "You can." "My leg." "I'll be behind you. You fall, I catch you. You stop, I push. You want to quit, I won't let you." Forge's voice was steady. The voice of a sergeant, the voice of a brother. "You spent 25 years getting to this ladder. You're climbing it." Nathan looked at him. Looked up at the circle of light at the top of the shaft. Dawn light, real light, the first natural light he would feel on his face in a quarter century. He grabbed the first rung. The climb took 11 minutes. Every rung was a battle. Nathan's arm shook, his left leg dragged against the shaft wall. Twice he stopped, pressed his forehead against the cold steel, and breathed. Forge stayed one rung below him, one hand on Nathan's belt, holding him against the ladder with the kind of stubborn, physical loyalty that doesn't know how to let go. Nathan's hand reached the surface. He gripped the edge of the shaft. Pulled. Forge pushed from below. And Nathan Mercer, Staff Sergeant, Special Operations, officially declared dead in 1999, buried alive for 25 years beneath the Arizona desert by the country he had served, crawled out of the ground and into the morning. The sun had risen. Not fully, just enough. The light was golden and long, cutting across the desert floor at an angle that turned the scrub brush into burning amber and the red earth into something that looked like the surface of another planet. The sky was clear, infinite. The kind of sky that exists only in the high desert, where there is nothing between you and the edge of the atmosphere except distance and light. Nathan lay on the concrete pad, face up, eyes open, staring at the sky. His chest heaved. Tears cut tracks through the dust on his face. Not sobbing, just water. The body's response to something the mind can't process. The physical evidence of a man's nervous system rebooting after 25 years of artificial containment. "Dad!" The voice split the morning open. Emma broke free of Clutch's arms and ran. She ran across the concrete pad with the speed of a child who has been waiting her entire life for this moment. Sneakers pounding, arms pumping, the pendant bouncing against her chest with every stride. Nathan heard her. He pushed himself up on one elbow. His face, the damaged, hollowed, aged face of a man who had been erased, transformed. Not into the face he'd had before. That face was gone, but into something new, something that contained both the ruin and the reason, the cost and the purpose. Emma hit him at full speed. Her arms went around his neck, her face buried in his shoulder. And Nathan's arms, the scarred, weak, trembling arms of a man who could barely climb a ladder, closed around his daughter with a strength that had nothing to do with muscle and everything to do with the fact that some forces in the human body cannot be diminished by time, imprisonment, or any amount of institutional cruelty. They held each other on the concrete pad in the Arizona dawn, while 27 rescued soldiers sat in ambulances and federal agents processed a crime scene and helicopters circled overhead, and the entire machinery of justice ground into motion around them like a system that had been frozen for decades and was finally, painfully, beginning to thaw. Forge watched from 20 feet away. He didn't approach. Some reunions are not for witnesses. They're for the people inside them, and everyone else should have the decency to look away. But he didn't look away. He watched. Because he needed to see it. He needed to know that the cost, the years, the guilt, the broken sun, the empty grave, the midnight rides, the whiskey poured on grass that covered nothing, had purchased something real. Clutch stood beside him. The big man's face was wet. He didn't wipe it. He let the tears sit on his cheeks and his silver beard, and he didn't care who saw. Wrench was sitting on the ground with his back against his motorcycle. His hands were shaking. They would always shake. But his eyes were still, focused, watching the man they'd mourned for 25 years hold the child they'd found 12 hours ago. And in that stillness, there was something that the tremor could never touch. Fuse stood alone near the perimeter fence, his face turned toward the sun, his eyes closed. He was breathing, slow, deep, deliberate. The way a man breathes when he's trying to memorize a moment, when he wants to be able to close his eyes in a dark apartment at 3 a.m. and return to this exact second, this exact light, this exact feeling. Bishop leaned against the lead federal vehicle with his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. He'd carried the heaviest secret of all, the Sunday phone calls from Marcus, the annual letters to Nathan, the knowledge that the Brotherhood's 2 greatest wounds were connected through him. He'd carried it silently, the way he carried everything. And now the weight was lifting, and what was underneath was not relief but something more complex. The understanding that loyalty sometimes means holding truths that hurt the people you love because releasing them would hurt them more. The investigation that followed would take months, then years. Greystone Pacific Defense Solutions would be dismantled from the inside out, its executives arrested, its contracts voided, its infrastructure seized by federal authorities who had to build an entirely new legal framework to prosecute crimes that had no precedent. The facility beneath the Mogollon Rim would be excavated, documented, and eventually sealed, not to hide it, but to preserve it as evidence of what happens when secrecy is given more authority than conscience. 27 soldiers would be returned to the world. Some would recover, some would not. The damage of prolonged captivity is not a wound that heals. It is a geology that reshapes the terrain permanently. But they would be alive. They would be named. They would be counted among the living for the first time in decades, and their families would have answers to questions they had stopped believing anyone would ever ask. Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Hask, the CO who had signed Nathan's false death certificate and then been swallowed by the same machine 12 years later, would testify before a closed congressional committee. His testimony would last 9 hours. He would describe in the steady, precise language of an officer who had spent 16 years in a cell composing his statement in his head exactly how the system worked, how soldiers were identified, how their deaths were fabricated, how the paperwork was routed through channels designed to avoid oversight, how the entire structure depended on one thing and one thing only: the assumption that no one would ever come looking. He was wrong about that. 5 men came looking, 5 aging bikers with bad knees and bad dreams and a bond forged in a bunker under fire. Men who wore matching pendants carved from salvaged titanium by a brother they thought they'd lost. 1 year later, Veterans Day, Route 89, Flagstaff, Arizona. The neon sign at Maggie's roadside had been fixed. All the letters worked now. Open 24 hours glowed pink and complete against the November dusk. The woman behind the counter, Maggie herself, it turned out, had replaced the cracked vinyl in the big booth and fixed the wobbling table. Not because she had to, because 5 men had asked her once to pretend she hadn't seen them, and she'd done it, and when the story came out, she'd understood that her diner had been the fulcrum point of something enormous, and the least she could do was fix the table. 5 motorcycles in the parking lot. Then a 6th. Nathan wrote a heritage classic that Wrench had rebuilt from frame to fender over the course of 8 months. He wrote it slowly, carefully, with the caution of a man whose body was still learning to trust open space. His left hip would never be right. His lungs carried the permanent rasp of decades of recycled air. His face, even after a year of sunshine and proper food, still held the topography of 25 years underground. The lines, the hollows, the scars that mapped a journey no human being should have to make. But he rode. Emma sat behind him, her arms around his waist, her chin resting on his back, watching the highway with the relaxed attention of a child who has learned, finally, that the road leads somewhere safe. They parked beside the other 5 bikes, engine off, kickstand down. Nathan swung his right leg over the seat and stood in the parking lot, breathing the November air, cold, clean, mineral sharp, the smell of high desert and coming weather. Forge was waiting by the door. The 2 men stood in the parking lot and looked at each other. They'd seen each other many times in the past year, at hospitals, at hearings, at the quiet apartment in Sedona, where Nathan and Emma had been living while the world slowly reconstructed the life that had been stolen from them. But this was different. This was the diner. This was the spot where the necklace had appeared around the neck of an 8-year-old girl on a frozen night, and 5 men had recognized the impossible engraving and decided to believe it. "Same booth?" Nathan asked. "Same booth." They went inside. The big booth. 6 men this time: Forge, Clutch, Wrench, Fuse, Bishop, Nathan. The table didn't wobble anymore. 6 black coffees. Maggie brought them without being asked. She'd added a hot chocolate for Emma, who sat at the end of the booth between Nathan and Clutch, her legs swinging beneath the table, her pendant resting on the outside of her shirt where anyone could see it. Forge reached under his collar and pulled out his own pendant, laid it on the table. Clutch did the same. Wrench, Whiskies, Bishop. Nathan looked at the 5 pieces of titanium on the formica surface. Then he reached into his shirt and pulled out the 6th, the original, the one Emma had carried, the one that had held the micro storage chip, The one that had traveled from a bunker in a war zone to an underground prison to an 8-year-old girl's neck to a forensic workbench in Sedona to a federal evidence room, and finally, after everything, back to the man who had made it. He placed it beside the others. 6 pendants. 6 imperfect pieces of hammered metal carved with a bayonet tip in a bunker that smelled like cordite and blood. Each one unique. Each one carrying a different serial, a different mark, a different flaw that was actually a signature. Together they formed a complete set for the first time in 25 years. Nobody spoke for a long time. The coffee cooled. The diner hummed its evening hum. The clock on the wall, the refrigerator behind the counter, a radio playing something country and soft that nobody was listening to. Emma broke the silence. "Can I have more marshmallows?" Clutch laughed. It was a sound so unexpected that Wrench spilled his coffee and Fuse actually flinched. Clutch, 6'3", 240. The man who could break a wrist without raising his pulse laughed with his whole chest, his whole body, the sound filling the diner the way dawn fills a room, gradually and then all at once. Maggie brought more marshmallows. Nathan watched his daughter drop them into her hot chocolate one at a time, counting them, arranging them in a pattern that only she understood. His hand rested on her back, lightly, carefully, the touch of a man who is still learning that the things he loves will not be taken from him if he reaches for them. "I thought about this," Nathan said. His voice was still rough. It would always be rough. But there was something underneath the damage now. A warmth, faint and fragile, like coals that have been buried under ash for decades and are just now being uncovered. Every day, in that cell, I thought about this booth, this coffee, the 6 of us. 5, Forge said quietly. "We were only 5. "No," Nathan shook his head. "You were always 6. I was always here. You just couldn't see me." He touched his pendant. "That was the whole point. That's why I made them. So that no matter where we were, no matter how far apart, no matter what walls they put between us, we'd still be in the same room." Forge looked at the pendants on the table. 6 pieces of metal that weighed almost nothing and carried the weight of everything. Cora came through this door at 7:15. She'd been invited. She'd almost declined. The year since the night at her workshop had been complicated. She and Forge existed in a space that was not forgiveness, but was not hostility either. A territory between 2 people who shared a wound they were both still learning to examine without flinching. She slid into a chair at the end of the table. Maggie brought her coffee without asking. Cora looked at Forge. Forge looked at Cora. "Marcus would have liked this," she said. Forge's throat closed. He nodded. Once. The nod of a man who has learned that some truths are too heavy for words, and the only honest response is the body's. The tightening of the jaw, the burning behind the eyes, the nod that says, "I know, and I carry it, and I will carry it every day for the rest of my life." Bishop reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small envelope. He placed it on the table in front of Forge. "What is this?" "The last letter Marcus sent me, before he died. He asked me to give it to you when I thought you were ready." Forge stared at the envelope, his son's handwriting on the front. Just one word. Dad. He didn't open it. Not here. Not now. Some things needed to be held before they could be read. Some messages needed to travel through the skin of the hands before they reached the eyes. He put it in his jacket pocket, over his heart, in the space where the pendant usually rested. Close to the heart, where it always is. Outside, the November sky turned from dusk to dark, and the neon sign cast its pink glow across the parking lot where 6 motorcycles stood in a row. 5 weathered and road-worn, 1 freshly rebuilt, all leaning on their kickstands at the same angle, all pointing in the same direction. Inside, an 8-year-old girl with marshmallow on her lip told a joke that only she thought was funny, and 6 men who had been to war and back and underground and back laughed anyway. Not because it was funny, but because laughter is the sound the body makes when it remembers, after a very long time, what safety feels like. The pendant stayed on the table for the rest of the night, 6 pieces of imperfect metal catching the diner light. Not proof of tragedy, not evidence of conspiracy, not artifacts of a war that never ended. Just a promise, made in a bunker, kept across decades, that no one gets left behind, that no one gets forgotten, that the men who wear the mark will come for you. Not because they are heroes, not because they are soldiers, not because they are brave, but because they are brothers, and brothers do not stop looking. Not after 25 years. Not ever.